The shock was so great that I was thrown off my chair into the hall, and the broken glass fell in showers upon me as I lay on the floor. 4 shells of 3-inch caliber fell on the gravel path in front of the main door, and another shell passed through the roof of the coals bunker attached to the powerhouse. That was part of a witness statement given by a Mr. Owen Fitzpatrick to a reporter from the New York Times in July 1916, in the middle of the First World War. I'm Sarah Churchwell, and welcome to Journey Through Time.
And I'm David Olusoga, and this is the second of our 2 episodes on the Black Tom explosion of 1916, the first terror attack on New York City, an event that, as you can tell from that quote, caused devastation across New York Harbour that sent blast waves crashing into the skyscrapers of Manhattan.
Okay, so let's recap for our listeners. It's the summer of 1916. We're in New York City. By this point, Germany has been engaged in a campaign of spying and sabotage operations in the United States for more than 2 years. American leaders had clear intelligence that it was happening. There is a really quite large network of spies, informers, bomb makers, saboteurs, all funded directly from Berlin. And they had been set up by 2 key German diplomats in the U.S. The first, Franz von Papen, was back in Germany by this point, and the other, Franz von Rintelen, was by then a prisoner of war in Britain. But the sabotage network they had created before they left was armed and fully in motion. And at that point, the sabotage ring turned their attention to Black Tom Island in New York Harbor.
Black Tom Island was the biggest arms exporting depot in the United States. It was the place from which shells and ammunition were exported to the armed forces of Britain, France and Russia to be used against Germany in the First World War. So it was inevitable, eventually, that would draw the attention of this sabotage ring. Let's go to the evening 2 days before the attack, the evening of July 28th, a warm summer's evening. A group of Germans gathered together at the house of a rather glamorous German New Yorker, a woman called Martha Held, a former opera singer who also claimed to be a German aristocrat. Her house is a large brownstone on West 15th Street, and it had become a sort of unofficial headquarters for German spies and German nationalists in New York, anybody who's supportive of Germany in the First World War. It was a place where people came together to share information, to pass on secrets. And the house had a cover story because Martha Held operated it also as a bordello.
And neighbors could hear them, couldn't they? There were complaints about all the noise that was being made.
There were constant complaints about Martha Held's opera singing.
And the women coming in and out, which is why people worked out that it was a bordello, right?
Yeah. It's the perfect cover for a spy operation, a bordello. It's a place that the police already knew about, but they knew about it for a different reason. Now, witnesses who gave testimony later reported that night bombs were being brought into the dining room of Martha Held's house, that maps of Black Tom Island, of this network of sidings and railway lines and docks, that they were being laid out on the dining room table, as were photographs of the key targets. And alcohol began to flow. The guests, towards the end of the evening, sang German patriotic songs, including Deutschland über alles, the German national anthem. But this is how the attack on Black Tom Island was launched, because among the people reported to be at Martha Held's house, or bordello, that night, were 2 relatively low-ranking German intelligence operatives, Lothar Witzka and Kurt Janker. Now, Witzka was young. It was said that he looked very young, almost like a boy. He was a sailor who'd been on a German ship in 1914 that had been sunk off the coast of South America by the Royal Navy. He literally had to swim for his life. He made his way through South America up to the United States, where he fell in with this network of German operatives. He began to spy on American munitions factories. Because he looked so young, he didn't look much of a threat, so people presumed he was harmless. Kurt Janker was a German spy who'd been operating in San Francisco. Now, Witzka was just a kid. Janker was a skilled operative, 34 years old, a big guy who was good at what he did.
There's a lot in the Black Tom story that makes you think that spy novelists were drawing from this story, right? It's actually setting up some of the cliches of espionage stories, as if Le Carre studied Black Tom or something.
Yeah, I mean, these are just almost unbelievable characters. The kid, the child sailor who ends up literally almost washed up on America's shores, the opera singer running a bordello. I mean, these are crazy characters. But this is deadly serious, because one night later, as the clocks turned midnight, and it was the early hours of July 30th, those two men, Lothar Witzka and Kurt Janker, were on a boat in New York Harbour, and they were rowing towards Black Tom Island in the total darkness. And they carried with them dynamite charges and incendiary bombs. These are bombs that contain chemicals that, when mixed together, ignite at very, very high temperatures. And they were well briefed. They understood the layout of Black Tom Island, and they had even learnt the symbols on the armaments crates and on the railway cars, so they knew which munitions were which. So they could pick out the most deadly explosives and plant their bombs beside them. At 12:30 a.m., they had finished placing their bombs, and they simply rowed away into the night. Now, we know what happened next from the many newspaper reports. A little before 1 a.m., a fire is spotted on Black Tom Island. At 1:20, the New Jersey firefighters arrive, but they are already too late, because just after 2 a.m, this really stops being the story of a fire, because thousands of pounds of TNT explode. This is the first in a series of explosions that are going to blast away across Manhattan, across New Jersey.
So it's a chain reaction.
It's a chain reaction as barge after barge full of munitions that would have been put onto ships to go to Europe, railway carriage after railway carriage begins to detonate. Huge amounts of destructive power, shells and ammunitions destined for the First World War, for the trenches, is now exploding on the southern tip of New York City, a city of 5 million people. There are literally shells flying through the air.
So the battlefield literally came to New York City. It was no longer over there.
Yeah, the war had really come home to America. There's flashes of light as each railway car, each barge explodes, and each explosion creates a blast wave that resonates across the harbour and crashes into New Jersey and into Manhattan. I was looking at accounts from the night, from the newspapers, and it's as important when you read those accounts to look at the map of New York. When you see the damage, you realise how far these blast waves have travelled and how extraordinarily powerful these explosions were. There is damage on 42nd Street. The windows of JP Morgan, all of them are blown out by one of the blasts. That's a mile away?
Yeah, it's a mile away across the river, and it's a couple miles north, actually, into Midtown as well.
Into Midtown?
Yeah. 42nd Street is the heart of Times Square.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God. The explosions are reported to shake the Brooklyn Bridge, and windows were broken, not just in Manhattan. Windows are reported to have been broken 25 miles away from the blast site, and shockwaves are detected 100 miles away in Philadelphia.
And we're talking about the locations there. Black Tom Island, as we said in the previous episode, was located right off of Jersey City, which, as we're saying, is about a mile across the Hudson River from Lower Manhattan. So naturally, there was also huge damage in Jersey City itself, right? Buildings were damaged. Again, windows were shattered. 20 miles up the Hudson, John D. Rockefeller was asleep in his mansion overlooking the river, and he woke up thinking it was an earthquake.
There's lots of reports of people presuming that this is an earthquake. The headline the next day from the New York Times, I think, says it all. It says, "Barge cargoes blow up. Sparks from small blaze reach explosives. Firemen trapped. City is terror-stricken," and that's in bold capitals. Great part of the population rushes to the streets, many in night attire, seeking safety. River bridges tremble. Cars crossing lose windows. All police called to prevent the looting of stores. I mean, that's just a list of bad things. It's almost as if the journalists have forgotten how to write journalistic prose. They are overwhelmed by the events of the night. Some of the best reports are of people in their nightclothes, as it says, walking around on streets in Times Square that are carpeted with broken glass.
As you say, they were reaching for any way to describe this. And, you can hear the chaos in that description, but there was an obvious comparison to hand. And I was looking at the papers as well. And the New York Herald the next day said that it was as if the Great War had erupted in New York City that night. And this is their literal comparison. They said, between the two mighty explosions came the manifestation as of an American Verdun, right? And of course, Verdun is the great battle being fought that very summer. Bombs soared into the air. This is the Herald again. Bombs soared into the air and burst 1,000 feet above the harbor. Shrapnel peppered brick walls, and only a man fresh from the trenches would have felt at home. And given that the munitions were intended for the Western Front, it was all quite literal.
Yeah, it really was. This was the First World War coming home to New York. New York was part of the war, the biggest munitions exporting facility in America, right in New York Harbor, an obvious target.
A year before the United States actually entered the war.
It's important we keep remembering this. America is a neutral nation, and yet this vast explosion, this attack, has taken place in a city of 5 million people. There's lots of conflicted reports in the days that follow where people try to estimate the death toll. The Jersey Journal says 50 believed dead, 21 injured. The New York Tribune reads only 4 known dead in munitions explosion. What finally becomes clear is that 7 people have died, including a 10-week-old baby. Now, that is an absolute tragedy. But it's also quite a small number, a surprisingly small number, given the explosive power that had detonated that night.
It's an incredibly small number. You would think that how could both cities, not just New York City, but Jersey City, they got off, as you say, we're not making light of 10, deaths, including a baby. But the idea that an explosion of that scale could have ended with so few fatalities is actually really incredible.
It is an amazingly small number, but the death toll may well have been higher. This could be an underestimation.
I mean, it would almost have to be, right?
What historians have begun to speculate is that the death toll might have been higher because of people who were undocumented. Homeless people, day labourers, transient workers, people on the margins of society who lived in barges, who lived in shanty towns around Black Tom Island, people who kind of just weren't on the records, whose deaths might not be recorded. The best book on the Black Tom explosion, a book called The Detonators by Chad Millman, that suggests that hundreds, maybe even thousands of people could have been killed, but they existed outside official records, so there was no real way for their deaths to be accounted for. So we'll never really know the death toll of the Black Tom explosion. We do know a lot, however, about the damage done to Manhattan, to Jersey City, but perhaps the most famous structure damaged in the Black Tom explosion was something that stands on an island then called Bedloe's Island, very close, 500 meters away from Black Tom Island, and that's the Statue of Liberty.
And the Statue of Liberty was quite new at that point, right? In 1916, it's only 30 years old. It had been unveiled in 1886, but it's already a symbol of the United States of America.
And it's beside another island. I mean, there are 3 islands in the harbour, Black Tom, Liberty Island as it is now, but there's also Ellis Island, which is the great facility for processing immigrants to America. And that story of immigration and the Statue of Liberty had become very much intertwined. It was the symbol of arriving in a new country, of this becoming your new home.
Already, right? So 30 years in, Ellis Island is becoming increasingly symbolic. And of course, now it's highly symbolic, as you say, as the home of immigration in the U.S. And then the Statue of Liberty with all of its very familiar symbolism. And one of the things that's amazing is you think about these 3 places right next to each other, Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty, and Black Tom Island. All 3 of them are deeply symbolic. And yet there are 2 that we are literally still household names. And Black Tom Island that literally nobody has heard of who isn't a specialist historian in the subject.
And on that night in July 1916 Black Tom almost did for the other two islands. There's serious damage to Ellis Island, to the immigrant processing facility. Its windows are blown out. There is at one point a barge full of explosives that is drifting towards Ellis Island. The immigrants have to be evacuated. I mean, this is, if you were somebody who just arrived on a ship from Europe, this is your new homeland. Yeah. This is not the best night to arrive in New York.
It's hard not to stop and think about what it would feel like, isn't it? I mean, some of them were literally fleeing war. That's why, so they think, okay, I'm going to come to a safe harbor. And that's what America was promising at that point to immigrants. This is a safe harbor. And literally they land in the middle of a battlefield.
You were saying earlier about Black Tom Island being forgotten and this explosion being forgotten. One of the aspects of this story that I find makes it even harder to understand how it's been forgotten is that it damages the Statue of Liberty, probably the most famous symbol of America. I mean, it is quite badly damaged in the explosion. So shrapnel from Black Tom Island crashes into the copper skin of Lady Liberty, but there's also structural damage.
Well, indeed. And that structural damage was permanent. So every tourist who's ever visited the statue since 1916 has in fact encountered the legacy of Black Tom, whether they were aware of it or not, because you used to be able to climb into the torch. Now you can't.
Because of the structural damage.
Because of the structural damage. Because the torch was already a little bit shaky. So they were already a little bit worried about, they didn't quite have the health and safety measures that we have today. But then the damage to the torch was such that they actually removed that torch, eventually rebuilt it, but kept the torch closed off. So to this day, you still can't climb into the torch of the Statue of Liberty. But the part of the torch that was damaged by Black Tom is still in the Statue of Liberty Museum. So people are walking past it all the time without even realizing that there is this legacy of this incredible explosion that we don't know the history of.
And there's shrapnel marks in that torch, and there's shrapnel marks in the ringlets of Lady Liberty. I mean, this is damage to the most famous symbol of America, and yet forgotten.
It's amazing, actually, when you think about, as you said, how close the Statue of Liberty was to this massive explosion. It's actually incredible that the Statue of Liberty survived at all. We said last week that they're very clear. All of our listeners will be hearing the echoes and anticipations of the terror attacks on New York on 9/11. And when we think about the impact and the trauma of the destruction of the Twin Towers, imagine symbolically what it would mean if the Statue of Liberty had been destroyed.
Yeah, inevitably, there's been deaths, there's been damage. The newspapers begin to speculate what has caused this explosion. Now, it is well known, and it's been well reported in American newspapers, that German agents are involved in sabotage operations in the United States. That is a national scandal. It is well known. And yet, in the aftermath of the Black Tom explosion, the authorities write it off as an accident. There is a bit of an investigation, but not much.
I mean, there had been a lot of accidents, right? There had been this trail of suspicious accidents that we'd been talking about. And yet, instead of saying this is yet another in a long chain of suspicious accidents, maybe we should stop treating them as accidents, they do it the other way around and go, well, I guess we just had another accident. It's kind of incredible. You think there's something this big, you would think surely they would need to get to the bottom of it, but they just don't.
Well, there are arrests, but not of German agents. The police arrest the presidents of the dock company and the railway company that operated Black Tom Island, and they are briefly investigated, but then released. And then a report into the explosion was published by the Bureau of Investigation, which is the precursor to the FBI, and that concluded that the explosion was not the work of saboteurs. Now, President Wilson remains committed to his policy of neutrality. And it is important to remember this is an election year. He is running for re-election. And in a speech, he describes what happened that night in New York Harbor as a regrettable incident at a private railroad terminal.
Regrettable.
Regrettable. And that's it. Despite all the evidence of German sabotage operations in America, it is written off and Wilson decides not to act. Now, it's not difficult to see why Wilson wanted to keep America out of the First World War. But also what made it more believable that this explosion might have been an accident is because what happened at Black Tom Island was not unique. There is a shadow history to the First World War that we've forgotten about. Because if you look at a list of the most powerful explosions that take place during the war, most of them don't take place on the battlefield or on the Western Front.
It's an incredible statistic. Most of the most powerful explosions during the First World War take place off of the field of battle.
They take place nowhere near the front line. They take place in munitions factories, or they take place on munition ships. So 6 months after the Black Tom explosion, there's an explosion in the East End of London, in Silvertown, kills 73 people. The same year, a ship carrying 2,500 tons of explosives explodes in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. It kills 2,000 people, and it basically wipes that town off the face of the earth. The blast is estimated at 3 kilotons. Now, the nuclear explosion at Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. This is one of the biggest explosions there has ever been. There are explosions at ammunition plants in Germany. There's one in Syracuse in New York, another in Nottingham in England. So for the government to say to the American people in 1916 that the Black Tom explosion had just been another munitions accident, well, it kind of made sense. It was believable. It had what the CIA like to call plausible deniability.
Well, they call it plausible deniability later, right? Because as we're saying, we don't have a CIA yet. But, what you're describing then is an era during which, obviously, it isn't exactly that they're shrugging off that kind of, sequence of catastrophes, but that you're just living in a moment when wartime urgency and the rate of industrial production is just catastrophe after catastrophe just keeps happening. So you start to get fatalistic about it rather than, it's not reckless, it's just fatalism, isn't it?
It is, but you'd have to say that there is a lack of an urgency to investigate.
A lack of due diligence.
Yeah. The Wilson government is not desperately going looking for evidence to link what had happened in Black Tom to the known network of German sabotage operations. And so the Black Tom explosion, categorized as an accident rather than an act of sabotage, is not something that President Wilson is willing to get in the way of his strategy of American neutrality.
Because you would think, wouldn't you, at least, I know I would, that this is the kind of event that pushes a nation into a war. It's like Pearl Harbor. You would expect the U.S. to stand up and go, well, we have to enter the war now. But Wilson is absolutely determined that neutrality is going to win out over everything. And I do think it's important to reiterate, as you said a moment ago, it is an election year.
It's an election year, and Wilson's government basically suppresses interest in this story. Now, it does make the American public more suspicious of Germany. It does feed into growing anti-German sentiment, but the authorities just aren't willing to make the links between sabotage that they know is being carried out by German agents and what happened in New York Harbor. Now, the irony here is that this huge explosion in New York Harbor that brings devastation to Manhattan.
And Jersey City.
It's not the giant explosion that brings America into the First World War. It's a telegram, the Zimmermann telegram. A year later, 1917, the British intercept a secret telegram sent by Berlin to the government of Mexico, in which the Germans try to persuade Mexico to launch an attack on the United States, one of the craziest stories in the First World War, which is not lacking in crazy stories. So it was a telegram, not this vast explosion, that finally means President Wilson has to give up on his attempt at American neutrality, and America finally enters the First World War.
It is an amazing story, isn't it, David, the Zimmermann telegram? I think we should consider doing that crazy story for Journey Through Time, don't you?
We must do the Zimmermann telegram, but I don't want us to underestimate the craziness of the Black Tom explosion, because this is a story that had its own very strange afterlife. And after the break, we'll explain how it influenced strategies of internment in the Second World War and how it even played a strange role in the rise of Hitler and the Nazis.
Welcome back. We're in July 1916 on Black Tom Island, and there's just been a massive explosion. That explosion did have a strange aftermath, although it isn't what brought America into the war, as we said. But America does enter the war. World events rapidly move on, and Black Tom is soon forgotten.
That's exactly right. Black Tom is put down as an accident. America fights a world war. It's got other things on its mind. So this event, this accident, supposedly in New York Harbor, is kind of largely forgotten about. The story of how it re-emerged and how the people responsible for it were identified is utterly bizarre. It's to do with the separate peace treaty that Germany reached with America after the war. Because one of the demands of that treaty was that Germany pay compensation to American companies and American citizens who'd had their property damaged or destroyed because of German actions in the war. And to arbitrate settlements and to pay compensation and to arbitrate disagreements, what was called the Mixed Claims Commission was established. In the 1920s, Germany was desperate to get on the right side of the Americans, so they weren't going to get in the way of this. For the first 3 years that the commission operated, it settled 7,000 cases. It paid $80 million in compensation from Germany to Americans who'd lost property. Some of the claims weren't even contested. The German commissioners were just waving it through because this was a way of moving on from the war. And then, in March 1924, the railway company that had owned Black Tom Island submitted its claim for damage for the Black Tom explosion. And suddenly, the cooperative, smooth running of the Mixed Claims Commission comes to a halt. Because the story of what had happened in New York Harbor back in 1916 emerges into the world. And the fiction that this had been some sort of accident begins to fall apart.
Well, the Germans have gotten themselves into an awkward position, haven't they, right? Because it's in their interest to just pay. They're literally paying to make problems go away right now. And that's what they want to do. So that sounds great, except that in this case, if they do that, they have to admit that what happened at Black Tom Island was not only a terrorist attack, but it was a terrorist attack on a neutral nation. They basically have to say to America, yeah, we did sabotage you.
Yeah, the issue is not the money. They're not worried about having to pay compensation to the railway company. They're issued about accepting that this is what they did. And German sabotage operations being discussed around the world. But what the Germans work out is that the lawyers working for the railway company, who are pretty good, that sooner or later they are going to piece this all together. They've got filing cabinets full of documents captured by the Americans in 1917. They've got information from British secret services, intercepts of German communications from during the war. They are eventually going to piece this together and work out who was responsible. So the German government decides, look, it's going to be embarrassing, but let's just pay. So they agree to settle the case and pay $18 million in compensation to the railway company. But at this moment, Franz von Papen, the German spy who had helped set up the German sabotage network, he re-enters the story. But suddenly, because this case is in front of the Mixed Claims Commission, he is being named in documents that are coming out in public as having been a spy during the First World War, involved in sabotage operations. Now, this is embarrassing, but it's also an opportunity because he's busy trying to build his name as a politician at a moment when German politics is becoming more nationalistic, or it's becoming more dangerous. The great resentment that is just eating away at Germany in the 1920s is the infamous war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty, Article 231, that said Germany and Germans were to blame for the war. So von Papen seizes the opportunity and he starts a campaign arguing that if Germany pays this $18 million in compensation to an American railway company, it would mean Germany yet again admitting guilt, and that this was not a matter of compensation, this was a matter of German honor. He is trying to subvert what's going on, distract attention away from the fact that he's being fingered as a spy and a saboteur, and saying this is actually about German honor.
Instead of an individual German's guilt, because he was guilty, right? So this elaborate deflection where he says, well, this would be admitting that Germany was to blame. And it's like, no, it's just you, actually. You were to blame.
It's kind of brilliant. You know, he's on the hook for having been a saboteur, having helped launch an attack on a neutral country during the First World War. And he suddenly says, no, I'm innocent. And Germany's innocent.
All of us are innocent.
Yeah, bring it on. We'll see you in court. He gives this speech where he says, my record is clean. I positively demand a hearing of this lawsuit with the broadest publicity so that I can once and for all draw the line and end these procedures from the American side. Now, for people who have been told that Germany is guilty, for Germans who are sick of carrying the sort of burden of this war guilt, this is kind of refreshing. And it increases von Papen's political standing.
He is feeding a very real act of sabotage into the mythology of the stab in the back that fueled the rise of the Nazis.
He is exploiting this moment where his responsibility, his participation in sabotage operations, rather than being the end of his career, in some ways becomes the making of his career because it puts it on a different trajectory. The battle over Black Tom Island, over compensation, whether to pay it or whether not, that is one of a series of events that puts Franz von Papen on a path that leads to him playing a pivotal role in one of the most catastrophic political decisions of the 20th century, arguably one of the most disastrous political decisions of all time. Because if that name, Franz von Papen, sounds familiar, there's a reason for this. Because he is the politician who in January 1933 persuades Hindenburg, the German president, to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor in a coalition government. Von Papen was to be the Vice-Chancellor. Most of the members of that cabinet were not to be members of the Nazi Party. And von Papen, the aristocrat, the hard-drinking, womanizing diplomat, he convinces himself that, along with the other politicians in the coalition, they can manage Hitler. They can control Hitler. They might even be able to manipulate him. The most famous quote from this moment is that von Papen is reported to have said that the coalition would push Hitler into a corner. And as listeners will know, as miscalculations go, that was possibly the worst miscalculation in history because, of course, it was Hitler, not von Papen, who did the outmaneuvering, passing laws that gave him more and more power, that allowed him to dismantle the German state and eventually make himself Führer. And we know where that led.
So we said earlier that Black Tom, as an actual explosion, was a chain reaction, but it's also a historical chain reaction, and it led, as you're saying, in very important ways, directly to Hitler.
Von Papen's career trajectory was changed by the moment when the Black Tom explosion case re-emerged into the public consciousness. It was part of building his career that meant he was the guy in the room with Hindenburg making those decisions in 1933. Who knows who might have been in the room had his career not taken that trajectory? Who knows what decisions they might have made?
Or indeed, if von Papen might have concluded if the outcome of Black Tom was different, if he might have been less arrogant in his approach, if he had had to face more consequences for his actions in the past. But he was convinced he could manipulate presidents. He was convinced he could manipulate leaders and he would get away with it. And the aftermath of Black Tom had left him with the illusion that he was in charge intact.
As you say, this is someone who's got away with things.
Not Hitler.
Yeah, not Hitler. The Black Tom explosion case was still unresolved. It was still in the courts when Hitler came to power, having brushed von Papen aside in 1933. Eventually, after 13 years of legal cases, the Mixed Claim Commission concluded that Germany had been responsible and awarded $50 million in compensation for the Black Tom explosion. But the year of that decision, the year of that award, was 1939.
Another familiar year.
Yeah. Of course, Hitler's government did not pay. It was not until 1953 that the German government, the post-war German government, did agree to pay the compensation, which means that liberal democratic West Germany paid for an act of terror carried out by Imperial Germany, the Germany not of the Third Reich, but of the Second Reich. And the final payment for the Black Tom explosion wasn't handed over until 1979.
So the Kaiser's Germany plants the bombs, Nazi Germany refuses to pay, and West Germany cleans up the mess.
They get the bill.
They get the bill, yeah.
But the people actually involved, von Papen, von Rintelen, Lothar Witzka, Kurt Janker, the two men who planted the bombs, none of them are ever brought to justice. And let's remember, people did die in the Black Tom explosion, as well as all of the damage. People died. these men were never, ever brought to justice for an act of terror against a neutral nation.
So as extraordinary as that story is, David, though, it's not the only extraordinary outcome of the Black Tom story, is it?
For an event that's been forgotten, it has lots and lots of consequences, not just the strange, disturbing political career of Franz von Papen. One of the other ways it impacts the later 20th century is that one of the lawyers hired by the railway company to fight their case in the Mixed Claims Commission is a guy called John J. McCloy. Now, in the Second World War, he becomes Assistant Secretary of War. And he got that job in part because he knew so much about espionage and sabotage, having spent years working on the Black Tom compensation case. But in that role, he also oversaw the internment of Japanese Americans after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And his boss, of course, was the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And when justifying the internment of 120,000 American citizens of Japanese origin, Roosevelt is said to have told John McCloy that these innocent people had to be imprisoned because we don't want any more Black Toms.
It's chilling and incredible to just stop and think about the fact that this story that has been so largely forgotten is the direct cause of a historical trauma and wrongdoing that American history and collective memory is still very much, actually only just begun really coming to terms with.
It shows that this story literally lives on. I mean, this is 110 years ago, but there are people alive today who were children in the Second World War, Japanese Americans, who are still living with the trauma of losing their homes, having their families thrown into these makeshift camps. The Star Trek actor, George Takei, he has childhood memories. He's written and spoken about his memories of being sent to an internment camp because his family are Japanese. And I think many Americans regard that decision to intern the Japanese population as one of the sort of low points of America's record in the Second World War.
Oh, without any question. Certainly I do. And I know a lot of people who do as well. Because it's this sense that there's this kind of terrible continuity of scapegoating across, from the First World War, it's the German Americans, and then the Second World War, it's Japanese Americans, but also for the way that Americans want to, in popular memory, to think about the Second World War is the idea that the Germans were the ones doing the scapegoating, obviously, of Jews and persecuting them, and the Americans weren't doing that. And that's why, of course, there was a cover-up for as long as there was. And it's only been through the efforts of activists like George Takei in insisting that American popular memory come to terms with this, that we've admitted that it happened at all.
Absolutely. What happened in Black Tom Island also culturally changed America. And in some ways, maybe the longest lasting and deepest running changes are cultural because it showed just how vulnerable America was to foreign sabotage. I mean, it is amazing that before the Black Tom explosion, before the First World War, before this campaign of German sabotage, there were no federal laws to counter spying or espionage by foreign nations when America was at peace. Now, there were laws that kicked in when America went to war, but there were no laws that prevented spying or sabotage in peace.
It was like it hadn't occurred to Americans yet that could happen, but Black Tom did change that.
Well, it was after the Black Tom explosion that the Wilson administration passed the Espionage Act of 1917. It was again after Black Tom that the Sedition Act of 1918 was passed. And that law made it a crime, and I'm going to quote from the law, to willfully urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of the production of materials necessary for the war effort, which is exactly what Black Tom had been about, trying to stop war materials being produced and reaching the Western Allies. Now, it's amazing that none of those laws were in place in 1916. But as well as passing new laws, America began to develop the counterintelligence operations and the security apparatus that Britain, France, and Germany all had at the beginning of the First World War. The agencies that weren't there to prevent this German network establishing itself in the first place.
And that's an immense legacy. And that alone makes clear that Black Tom is far from some kind of historical curiosity that we've just dug up, right? It's the laying the foundations of the American security state. And we have to keep relearning that lesson, 1941, 2001. But it starts here with a handful of German saboteurs showing America how vulnerable it was.
The First World War inspires the formation of the Bureau of Investigation, the first domestic security unit, which becomes the FBI. It is a kind of moment of maturity for America. It's a strange word to use about the United States, but it was in 1916, before these events, a strangely unworldly nation. The Black Tom explosion was one of the events that made America into the kind of global power that it is today.
So we've been talking across 2 episodes telling this amazing story of Black Tom, and we keep commenting on how extraordinary it is that all of this was forgotten. So David, why was it all forgotten? What do you think? How on earth could this not have been remembered?
I think the most important thing is that death toll. Not many people died. We think 7 people, though many homeless, undocumented people may well have perished as well. Had this blast, as well as breaking windows in Manhattan, killed hundreds or thousands in Manhattan, I think there's no chance it would not be a better known story. And I think its impact on President Wilson's strategy of neutrality would have been far stronger. It would have been much more difficult for Wilson to maintain neutrality and claim this was an accident if the death toll had been higher.
It probably would have propelled us into the war, actually.
It could have been the event rather than the Zimmermann telegram that led America into the First World War. I think if the explosion had destroyed the Statue of Liberty, it would have been...
Oh, we'll go to war over that, you bet.
Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty hard. Lady Liberty lying at the bottom of
God,
New York
don't say
Harbour.
that. Oh, God.
Does that image shock?
Oh, really? No, it breaks my heart. I mean, honestly, it's a story. We're skeptical of getting it too attached to symbols, and we know what the political work is that they do. But, statue. I mean, that's like the end of Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, I was about to say, is that traumatic?
Yeah, it's too exactly. This is dystopia that you're describing to me, David.
Yeah, as your reaction suggests, I think that could have triggered America into war, and I think it would have meant the Black Tom explosion would have been looked into a lot more thoroughly. I suspect, and this really is just a supposition, it's a guess, is that part of it is that 1916 and the years that followed are some of the most terrible, most frenetic years in the 20th century, and that's saying something. You know, the following year, there's the Russian Revolution. There's the Spanish flu that's going to kill between 20 and 50 million people. There's the war itself that kills more than 20 million people. There's so much going on at this moment that this event, terrible though it was, destructive though it was, but, explained away as an accident, I don't think it quite punches through in the way it might have done had this been a quieter time in world history and American history.
As you're saying, it gets superseded by a rapid series of massive traumas, but also the degree to which the truth didn't come out until much later when there were even more traumas, because it doesn't come out, as we're saying, until the 20s, and then it drags on, and then it's actually the post-war. And by then, you've got the reckoning with the Holocaust. Black Tom is not what you're going to spend your energy worrying about.
Yeah. If the names of the saboteurs had been discovered in 1916, 1917, I think that would have made it a big story. But the way the information is drip-fed over 13 years of court cases with documents being discovered, individuals being named in a slow way, it's just not that great a story. And that's the problem. Looking back at it, with all the information we now know, we can see that this is an astonishing, terrible, almost unbelievable story. But the way the information emerged to people who lived through these decades is very unsatisfying. And we are creatures who love story. We want to know who did it. We want to know the guilty men. It's a sort of uncomfortable, slow piecing together of the evidence, which sort of doesn't create this sort of narrative that we want. And as I was saying, the 20th century is such a traumatic century that a story, it takes a lot to stand out in those decades, the years around the 2 world wars.
But also, I think, David, when we talk about what we want from a narrative, there's an emotional dimension to that, as you were saying, about whether it's a satisfying story. But when we're talking about history, there's frequently also a political dimension. What stories are useful? What stories does a nation want to remember? What tells it a story that it wants to hear about itself? Or what gives it some kind of political utility? And Black Tom doesn't have any of that, right? It's not a clear attack by a foreign enemy for the reasons that we're saying, but it's perpetrated in part by German Americans, as we said in the beginning. And this is not a story that America wants to tell about itself. The whole point about all of the conflict about the question of hyphenate Americans was, as we said, was Wilson's and many Americans, he's certainly representative, I think, in this way, fundamental belief that American exceptionalism will see us through, and all Americans love America the most. And the idea that this event was caused not only by a foreign enemy, which, is maybe a story that you can tell, but that it was also perpetrated by traitors within. I don't think that's a story, particularly in the 20th century, that Americans wanted to hear.
By the time all the evidence was gathered together, the world had moved on. It was the 1950s. There was the Cold War. It was a kind of story that missed its time.
It does, but that's exactly why it's the perfect story for historians to be able to put all the pieces back together again and explain who done it.
Yeah, because it's like a missing link that explains so many things about the 20th century, about individuals, about politics, about decisions that were later made, institutions and organizations that were later created. And without it, I think we have a kind of, a missing link in our understanding of the 20th century and America's role in it.
Well, on that note, I think that's probably where we should leave it. I hope you've enjoyed Journey Through Time. Join us next week when we've got the extraordinary story of the first woman to run for president of the United States in 1874. I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And I'm David Olusoga. Thank you for listening and see you next week.